The string quartet lifted the room like a held breath, and the ballroom glowed the way winter glass looks just before it breaks. I stood beside Gavin while 100 faces turned toward us, smiling expectant safe in the story they thought they knew. The champagne was cold in my hand, but my palms were warm, and I could smell Renee's white gardenia perfume before I saw her step from the crowd in her scarlet dress. Gavin cleared his throat, his wedding band catching the light, and for a heartbeat, I remembered him as the boy who used to spread law books across a futon and promise me a steady life. Our daughter Sophie touched my elbow. Her new bracelet tinkled a small bell at the end, and our son Evan stood on tiptoe to see over the shoulders in front of him. The orchestra softened. Gavin lifted his glass, then took one small step away from me, and the hush that followed landed in my chest like a stone dropped in deep water. Somewhere near the doors, the air shifted as if someone had opened a window to the night, and a familiar older silhouette paused on the threshold. I knew then that the story we'd been living was about to change its ending. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and if family stories like this help you fall asleep or finally make sense of what you've lived through. If you're new here, tap subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. It helps more than you know. My name is Marin, and for most of my 30s, I believed in quiet, ordinary goodness, a mortgage we could afford, kids who knew they were loved, a calendar full of school plays, and Saturday soccer. I grew up in a house where problems were folded into casseroles and taken to the neighbor. My parents taught me that family means showing up and honesty is how you sleep at night. Gavin and I met when we were 22 when rent was a dare, and our furniture was mostly borrowed. He had a way of making plans sound like promises, and I had a way of believing him. He went into estates and trusts the careful end of the law where families try to do right by each other. And I took a job at the community college, helping first-gen students figure out how to make first chances count. Renee slid into our lives early, and naturally my roommate turned sister in everything, the one who sat with me through morning sickness and held Sophie on the day she was born, the godmother who remembered every school recital and texted me late-night jokes when Gavin stayed at the office. We built a life that looked like a postcard if you didn't squint, a craftsman with a porch swing, mismatched mugs, that somehow matched a group of friends who rotated holiday dinners like a relay. Gavin worked too much, but we told ourselves that was the price of comfort. And when he bought nicer suits and started jogging again, I called it self-care, and kissed his cheek like a benediction. Renee's business took off galas, fundraisers, the sort of clients who sent flowers the size of small trees, and she had stories about venues and vendors that made our group laugh until we cried. I held those evenings close, the ones with candlelight on our dining table, and Evan dealing cards for Go Fish, while Sophie hummed lines from whatever show she was rehearsing. If there were small drafts under the doors of that life, I pressed rugs over them, a late meeting here, a changed plan there, a phone set face down on the counter with the gentlest of clicks. Some marriages run on faith the way cars run on gas. You don't measure it until the engine coughs. I used to think anniversaries were like mile markers, look up, wave at the sign, keep driving, but this one felt like a summit we'd earned. Renee insisted on helping, and what began as a dinner for friends turned into something grander. Strings instead of a playlist, roses instead of peonies, tuxedo instead of suit. Gavin seemed lighter as the date approached, almost boyish, bringing home my favorite wine and brushing my hair off my neck in the kitchen while the pasta boiled over. He called it making up for busy seasons. I told Nora it felt like spring arriving in a rush all at once, and she smiled the way nurses do when they're waiting for you to finish your sentence. I think about that now, the way the house smelled like lemon oil and fresh laundry, how Sophie practiced her toast in a whisper, how Evan tried on his tie and frowned at himself in the mirror, how easy it is to mistake a gathering storm for good weather when you're standing in the sun. We arrived early to check the final touches, and I remember smoothing a hand over the linen as if that could press out whatever crease had started to wrinkle my days. The quartet tuned, the lights warmed, the staff floated past with trays like steady planets in an easy orbit. Renee kissed my cheek and told me to breathe. Gavin grinned at me with that first apartment grin, the one that used to make the future feel like a room we were about to walk into together. Guests began to arrive, all perfume and laughter and glossy shoes on marble, and I swallowed the little bell of worry that kept ringing at the far edge of my attention. When the orchestra softened and Gavin lifted his glass, I felt Sophie's hand curl around mine, small but sure. And then, just as he took that step that changed the night, someone pushed the doors wide, and the room turned toward a man I hadn't seen in years. I didn't know yet how much would break, only that something had just been set in motion, and there was no gentle way to stop it. The first crack appeared on an ordinary weekday morning when I had no reason to expect my life was about to tilt. Sophie had fallen off her bike riding home from a neighbor's, and the pediatrician wanted to see her just to be sure nothing serious was overlooked. Gavin had already left for the office, his briefcase tucked under his arm, the way it always was, and his voice still in my ear, promising to be home late because of a client dinner. I was rifling through his office shelves, searching for our insurance folder, when a small slip of paper wedged between legal briefs caught my attention. The logo on the top was unmistakable: La Belle Maison, the French restaurant in town that people booked months ahead for anniversaries or milestone birthdays. We had only been there twice in 15 years of marriage, both times for occasions too significant to pass with anything less. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the receipt. 2 entrees, champagne dessert, and a bill that matched a week's worth of groceries. The date on the slip was last Thursday, the very night Gavin had called to say he was buried in work and wouldn't make it home before midnight. I sank into his leather chair, the coolness pressing against my arms, and stared at the words until they blurred. 100 explanations ran through my mind, each one flimsy and hollow. Perhaps he had been entertaining a client. Perhaps a colleague had needed company. But deep in the place where wives store their worst fears, I felt something heavier than coincidence. The truth crouched in the shadows of my thoughts, unspoken but undeniable. My phone buzzed, startling me. A text from Renee Coffey later. Need to talk. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. She had always been the one I ran to when life twisted the keeper of my secrets since we were 19. I typed back quickly, Sophie's appointment maybe tomorrow, and ended with love you, the way I always did. Only this time, the words tasted sour, each letter carving suspicion deeper into my chest. That night, I waited until the children were asleep before I laid the receipt on Gavin's desk. He looked up, his jaw tightening just slightly as his eyes landed on the paper. It was a business dinner, he said too smoothly. Estate clients, the Whitakers. I shook my head. She's been in assisted living for 6 months, Gavin. She isn't meeting anyone for dinner. The silence that followed stretched like a rope pulled taut. He turned back to his screen and muttered something about strategy sessions, but the lie hung heavy between us, undeniable, even as we both pretended otherwise. I slipped out of his office, past photographs that suddenly looked like props in someone else's play. Our wedding day framed in silver, Sophie's kindergarten portrait, with her gap-toothed smile, Evan holding his soccer trophy high. All of it seemed brittle now, the glossy cover of a book with chapters I hadn't read but was somehow living through. Nora listened the next morning as I poured out everything: the receipt, the hollow explanations, the text from Renee. She didn't try to soften the edges or tell me I was overthinking. Instead, she leaned across my kitchen table, her hand steady on mine. "You need to know," she said. "Not knowing will eat you alive. Let me follow him." Her words were matter-of-fact practical, the way she handled emergencies at the hospital. I resisted clinging to hope, but deep down, I knew she was right. The not knowing had already hollowed me out. That Thursday, I moved through the day like a ghost, packing lunches, folding laundry, forcing smiles at the library where I volunteered. At 3 o'clock, my phone rang. Nora's voice was low, hesitant. Marin? He's at the Riverview Hotel, room 608. He isn't alone. My knees buckled in the frozen foods aisle, surrounded by the ordinary clatter of carts and chatter. Who, I whispered, though I already knew. The pause was long enough to confirm it. Renee. The word carved through me like glass. I stood gripping the freezer handle while families bustled around me, laughing children reaching for ice cream, teenagers teasing each other by the soda display. Life went on as mine cracked wide open. Renee, who had stood by my side in a bridesmaid's dress, who had kissed my newborn daughter's forehead, who had planned every one of our birthdays with flair and love. My best friend of 2 decades, tangled in sheets with my husband. I drove home on instinct, the roads blurring past, and moved through the evening as if in a dream. Gavin returned at his usual time, kissing my cheek with the practiced ease of a man confident in his lies. We ate dinner as a family, Sophie chattering about her upcoming play, Evan describing a soccer drill. I smiled where I was supposed to smile, nodded when words were expected, and kept my secret folded inside me like a shard of glass pressed against skin. That night, while Gavin brushed his teeth, I stood in the doorway and studied the man I thought I knew. His phone rested on the nightstand, face down, the way it always did now. The scent of new cologne lingered in the room, and I realized it had been months since he smelled like home. He caught me staring and smiled through the mirror. You're quiet tonight. I forced a shrug. Just tired. He kissed my forehead as if he believed it. When the house went silent and his breathing evened beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought about Nora's steady hand, about Renee's too bright laugh on the phone, about the receipt still tucked in my drawer. I could have screamed, could have shaken him awake, demanded answers he would never give honestly. Instead, I chose silence. But inside that silence, something shifted. I was no longer a wife hoping for reassurance. I was a woman holding proof. And as the hours crept toward dawn, one thought repeated itself with unyielding clarity. This was only the beginning. I moved through the next days as if carrying a secret weight no one else could see. At breakfast, I poured cereal into bowls while Sophie practiced her lines for the school play and Evan asked about his soccer tournament. Gavin sipped coffee across the table, his tie already knotted, his phone buzzing every few minutes. To anyone looking in, we were a steady family of 4, starting an ordinary morning. Inside, my chest burned with questions I could not yet ask aloud. That evening, when the house had gone quiet, I reached for Gavin's phone. He had left it charging on the nightstand, while he showered, the glass screen glowing faintly in the dark. For weeks, he had guarded it, setting it face down, or carrying it into the bathroom. My hands shook as I tried the codes I knew by heart. His birthday, mine, the kids. None worked. Then I entered Renee's birthday, and the lock screen dissolved into messages that lit up my worst suspicions. The words scrolled across the screen, each one carving deeper into me. Renee, can't wait for tonight. Room 608 again. Gavin Ashley thinks I'm working late. She never questions. Renee. I felt guilty lying about coffee, but 2 hours with you was worth it. The thread stretched back months full of private jokes and plans, and at the bottom, a message that hollowed me out completely. Only 2 months until the anniversary. Then we can stop pretending. I can't wait to see her face when you choose me. I put the phone back exactly as I had found it, every muscle stiff with the effort of keeping my movements calm. When Gavin came out of the bathroom, his hair damp and his smile careless, I was sitting at my vanity brushing my hair as though nothing had happened. You're up late, he said, tugging on a t-shirt. Couldn't sleep, I answered, meeting his eyes in the mirror. But I have a feeling our anniversary is going to be unforgettable. He chuckled, too certain of his control to hear the edge in my voice. That night, I barely closed my eyes, and when the morning light seeped into our room, I knew one truth beyond any doubt. They were planning to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved, and if I did nothing, they would succeed. I thought of Sophie's smile as she practiced calligraphy on invitations of Evan's pride when he talked about wearing a tuxedo like his father. The betrayal was no longer mine, alone to carry. It was a wound aimed at all of us. I called Nora first. Her voice was steady, though I could hear anger tighten each word as I described the messages. "We need help," she said simply. "Not just proof, a plan." She gave me the number of an attorney she trusted, a woman named Margaret Chin, known for handling the kind of divorces that made headlines. When I asked about the cost, Nora didn't hesitate. "Marin, this isn't about money. It's about protecting you and the kids. Call her." Margaret's office was on the 40th floor of a glass tower downtown, a place that smelled faintly of leather and polished wood. She was younger than I expected, her dark hair pulled neatly back, her presence calm but sharp. I slid the folder of screenshots across her desk and waited while she read. Her brow lifted only once when she reached the line about the anniversary party. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Your husband has been careless. That will work in your favor. Do you want the simple version file, immediately freeze assets, move on, or do you want something more?" I didn't hesitate. I want them both to face what they've done. Her smile was small, knowing. "Then you'll need leverage. What do you know about your father-in-law's trust?" The question caught me. Charles had been absent for years, his relationship with Gavin severed by pride and distance. Nothing, I admitted. He never approved of me, and Gavin never spoke of him. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Then I suggest you speak with him now. From what I've seen, he values reputation. Public disgrace may matter more to him than loyalty to his son." I left her office with a strange mixture of dread and resolve. The streets below were alive with the ordinary rush of people carrying coffee and briefcases, while I carried something else entirely, a plan beginning to take shape. At home, Sophie chattered about rehearsal. Evan sprawled on the rug with his soccer cards, and Gavin kissed my cheek as if we were still the couple in the photographs lining the hallway. I smiled back my mask, as practiced as his. Renee called 2 nights later, her voice bright and false. "How are the party plans coming? I can't wait. It's going to be magical." I gripped the phone until my knuckles whitened, forcing myself to answer evenly. "It will certainly be a night to remember." She laughed, the sound I had once found comforting, now laced with poison. "You sound tired, Marin. Don't worry. It will all come together perfectly." When I hung up, I sat in the kitchen and let the fury wash over me until I could breathe again. I began noticing every small detail that had once slid past me. The way Gavin slipped away in the evenings, the scent of cologne that wasn't the one he had worn for years. The way his eyes lingered on his phone instead of on me. Each sign was another confirmation, another cut that I refused to let bleed me dry. Instead, I stored them like matches, knowing I would strike them all at once. The children, innocent in their excitement, made it harder. Sophie spent hours designing place cards, her careful hand looping letters as she hummed. Evan insisted on polishing his shoes, eager to look grown up beside his father. Watching them, I felt my heart twist. They deserved better than to have their father's betrayal played out like a spectacle. And yet, it was the very thought of them that steeled my resolve. They needed to see that actions had consequences, that cruelty dressed as love could not stand unchallenged. One evening, Gavin brought home flowers, laying them on the counter, as though we were still in the tender years of our marriage. "You deserve to be spoiled," he said, lightly, kissing the back of my hand. I smiled, thanking him, but inside, I thought only of the messages he had sent Renee that same afternoon. It was a strange sort of strength carrying his secrets while planning how to use them. As the weeks slid closer to the anniversary, I contacted Charles. It was not an easy decision, our history was strained at best, but Margaret was right. He was the key to turning humiliation back on the ones who had planned it. Sitting in my car outside his gates, I felt the nerves crawl up my arms, but I pressed the buzzer anyway. When his voice crackled through the speaker, I said calmly, "It's Marin. I need to see you." The gate opened, and with it the first true step toward the end of the life I had once thought unshakable. The wrought iron gates opened with mechanical precision, and I eased the car up the long drive toward the house that seemed more like a monument than a home. Charles's estate spread across acres of manicured lawns and stone pathways, the kind of wealth Gavin had always pretended he didn't need, but silently counted on. My palms were damp against the steering wheel, and I found myself rehearsing sentences in my head, though none felt strong enough to carry what I was about to reveal. Charles answered the door himself, which startled me. At 72, he still carried himself like a man who had no intention of fading quietly. His silver hair was cut close, his slate-gray eyes sharp, and though he was dressed in slacks and a crisp white shirt, he looked as commanding as any photograph I had seen of him in business magazines. He stepped aside, giving me space to enter without comment. The study was everything I expected: dark wood, towering shelves, windows that overlooked gardens trimmed to perfection. He gestured to one of the leather chairs and settled behind his desk waiting. "You've never come here without Gavin?" he said after a pause. "Why now?" The directness left no room for hesitation. I told him everything. The receipt tucked into legal briefs, the text messages, the hotel room, the anniversary party where Gavin planned to propose to Renee while our children looked on. My voice wavered only once when I described Sophie's excitement in designing place cards and how Evan had begged to wear a tuxedo. Charles listened without interruption, his face still, but growing darker as each detail landed. When I finished, the silence stretched so long that I heard the clock on the mantel tick. At last, he stood and crossed to the window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "How long have you known?" he asked. "A week," I said, quietly. "And you haven't confronted him?" I shook my head. "Not yet. They want to humiliate me publicly, and I won't give them the satisfaction of thinking I never saw it coming." He turned, and for the first time, his expression softened. "You came here not to beg for my help, but to tell me the truth." I nodded. "I thought you should know what kind of man your son has become." Charles walked back to his desk, lowering himself slowly into the chair. "Gavin has always been difficult," he said, his voice quieter now. "Rebellious, impatient, eager to prove he needed nothing from me. But I never thought he would be cruel." His gaze held mine. "And cruelty deserves consequences." I swallowed, unsure of his meaning, until he opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "The family trust has conditions. Adultery, abandonment, public disgrace, all are grounds for revision. If Gavin goes through with this spectacle, I will disinherit him entirely. The trust will pass directly to you and the children." The air seemed to shift around me. For years, Gavin had lived well beyond his salary, taking comfort in the promise of a fortune he assumed would one day be his. If Charles followed through, Gavin would be stripped not just of reputation, but of the very security he relied on. "Why?" I asked softly. "Why would you do this for me?" Charles leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Because you have been a good wife to him and a devoted mother to my grandchildren. Because you had the courage to face me when Gavin would not, and because I will not allow his selfishness to define their future." For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. I felt the stirrings of hope. Charles outlined what needed to happen next. I was to continue with the party preparations exactly as planned. I was to act as if nothing was wrong. And when Gavin and Renee made their grand announcement, he and I would both be ready. I drove away from the estate with my heart pounding, the gardens fading in my rearview mirror. The plan was dangerous. It meant weeks of pretending, of swallowing my anger, of smiling at Gavin while he carried on his charade. But the alternative, confronting him now, giving him time to regroup and twist the story, held no appeal. That night at dinner, Gavin told the children about a new client. His voice animated, his eyes bright. Sophie asked if she could show him the calligraphy she had been practicing, and Evan chattered about soccer drills. I nodded and smiled, all while feeling the folded screenshots heavy in my purse, the promise of Charles's support steadying me like an anchor. Renee called the next afternoon, her voice brimming with cheer. "Just checking on you. How are you holding up with all the planning?" Her words felt like daggers cloaked in sweetness. "I'm fine," I answered evenly. "It will be a night no one forgets." She laughed, oblivious, and promised to stop by next week to help finalize the menu. I held the phone long after the line went dead, the rage in my chest settling into something harder, colder, more controlled. Nora came by that evening, folding laundry beside me at the kitchen table while the kids worked on homework. "You look different," she said finally, watching me. "More certain." I told her about Charles, about the trust, about the plan to let Gavin expose himself. Her eyes widened, but she nodded slowly. "It's risky," she said, "but maybe it's exactly what he deserves." As the days slipped closer to the anniversary, I rehearsed my part like an actress preparing for the role of her life. I smiled at Gavin's sudden bursts of affection, accepted flowers on the counter, laughed when he brushed my hair from my shoulder. Every gesture meant to soothe his conscience only sharpened my resolve. The children remained blissfully unaware, their excitement growing by the day. Sophie practiced her toast in front of the mirror, while Evan laid out his suit and shoes. I tucked them into bed at night with a steady voice, then stood in the hallway afterward, letting the tears fall, only when the doors were closed. 3 nights before the party, I couldn't sleep. I slipped from bed and wandered through the house, touching the photographs on the walls, the worn edges of furniture chosen in happier years. I paused in Sophie's room, watching her chest rise and fall in sleep, then in Evan's, where his arm curled around the stuffed animal he still kept close. I whispered promises they would never hear, that whatever happened, I would protect them, that this betrayal would not define who they became. Back in my own room, I stood at the window, the garden silvered in moonlight. Tomorrow, the preparations would be complete. The day after, the guests would arrive. And then, at last, the truth would break free, no longer mine to carry alone. The morning after my meeting with Charles, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open and a pen steady in my hand. Sophie and Evan had already left for school, their chatter lingering faintly in the silence of the house. Gavin had gone early too, leaving only the faint trace of his cologne and the clink of his mug in the sink. I stared at the blank page until the words began to form lists, dates, reminders, each one a step in the path I had chosen. Every day after that carried a quiet duality. Outwardly, I was the wife preparing for a grand anniversary, answering questions about flowers and menus, smiling when Renee called with her cheerful suggestions. Inwardly, I was the woman who carried a folder of evidence in her purse, who kept a lawyer's number saved under an innocuous name, who replayed Charles's voice telling me cruelty deserves consequences. Margaret called that week, her tone brisk but reassuring. "We'll be ready when the time comes," she told me. "I've drafted preliminary filings and Charles has already sent word to his accountants. If your husband insists on exposing himself, the fallout will be immediate." I thanked her, hearing the scratch of her pen on paper as she took notes while we spoke. Hanging up, I felt a steadiness settle inside me. The net was forming, each strand woven tighter, and Gavin had no idea he was walking straight into it. Renee stopped by one afternoon, her red nails drumming against the countertop, as she flipped through the menu cards Sophie had carefully designed. "Everything looks incredible," she said warmly, her eyes shining with the satisfaction of secrets she thought she still held. "You must be so excited." I kept my hands folded in my lap, hiding their tension, and nodded. "Yes," I said softly. "It's going to be a night no one forgets." She smiled, completely unaware that her name was already penciled into a police officer's file, her transactions recorded, and waiting for the right moment. The hardest part was keeping my face still around the children. Sophie's excitement grew each day, her eyes sparkling as she practiced her lines in front of the mirror. Evan carried his new shoes to me proudly, asking if they looked grown up enough to stand beside his father. I tucked them both into bed with steady hands, but afterward, I stood in the hallway, pressing my forehead to the wall, the weight of what they didn't yet know, pressing heavy on my chest. 3 days before the party, Nora came over with groceries and her quiet strength. We sat at the table, folding napkins, and she watched me carefully. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "It isn't too late to stop." I looked at her, my voice low but unwavering. "They're planning to humiliate me in front of everyone we know, in front of our children. Why should they get to do that without consequence?" Her hand closed around mine, her grip steady. "Then I'll stand with you," she said. "Whatever happens." Gavin seemed lighter as the day approached, his smile easier, his touches more frequent, as though overcompensating for the betrayal he carried in his pocket. One evening, he came home with flowers, placing them in a vase on the counter. "You've outdone yourself," he told me. "The party will be perfect." I met his eyes and nodded, the words steady in my throat. "Yes, it will. The night before the event, I couldn't sleep." I walked through the quiet house, touching the backs of chairs, the frames on the walls, the door frames marked faintly with pencil lines, where we had measured the children's heights over the years. In Sophie's room, she slept with her notes for the toast still clutched in her hand. Evan's arm curled protectively around the stuffed bear he still carried, though he would never admit it to his friends. I bent down, kissed each of them softly, and whispered promises I could not break. Back in my room, Gavin slept easily, his breathing even. I stood at the window, the garden bathed in moonlight, and thought of everything that would change tomorrow. By the end of the night, he would be stripped of the wealth he had always taken for granted. Renee would face the truth of her crimes, her smile wiped away not by me, but by the law. And most of all, my children would see that their mother had not been blind, that strength could live quietly until it was called upon. The morning of the party dawned, bright sunlight streaming through the curtains, as though mocking the storm building beneath the surface. I dressed carefully, smoothing the fabric of the emerald gown Gavin had once admired, fastening the necklace my mother had given me years ago. When Sophie twirled in her pale pink dress and Evan adjusted his bow tie with serious concentration, I smiled at them both, my chest aching with pride and sorrow all at once. As we left the house, Gavin's hand pressed gently against the small of my back, his confidence radiating like heat. He had no idea that every step we took brought him closer to his own undoing. The ballroom glittered, as though every light had been polished to catch the smallest breath of movement. Roses in crystal vases lined the tables, their fragrance drifting through the room like memory. Guests arrived in steady waves, shaking Gavin's hand, hugging me, marveling at the arrangements that bore Renee's careful signature. The quartet played softly, each note floating above the laughter and clinking glasses. I smiled at every face accepted congratulations, and held myself steady beneath the weight of the emerald silk gown. Sophie stood near the stage rehearsing her words under her breath, the note cards trembling just slightly in her hands. Evan tugged at his bow tie, his expression serious as he leaned against Nora's side. She bent to whisper something to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, and I caught her glance across the room. It was a silent exchange, a reminder that I was not standing alone in what was about to come. Renee drifted through the room in a gown the color of spilled wine, her perfume trailing in her wake. She greeted guests with the practiced warmth of someone who had orchestrated every detail. But her eyes sought Gavin, constantly hungry for his acknowledgement. When their gazes met, he smiled too long, too easily, and the air between them shimmered with secrets. The sight carved deep, but I held my glass steady, my face composed. I had promised myself I would not falter now. As the dinner plates cleared, Gavin rose from his seat, tapping his glass with the silver fork he had tucked casually into his palm. The music stilled, conversations quieted, and 200 eyes turned toward him. He began with charm, thanking our friends for gathering, praising Renee for her flawless work, glancing at me with a smile so convincing it might have fooled even me if I hadn't known the truth. His voice carried across the room, smooth, confident, rehearsed. Then with a breath, he shifted. 15 years ago, he said I married a woman who gave me 2 wonderful children. For that, I will always be grateful. A ripple of polite applause followed, but I saw Nora's jaw tighten, her hand close firmly around Sophie's trembling fingers. Gavin continued, his tone brighter, his eyes now searching for Renee. But life is long, and sometimes paths cross that change us forever. My chest hollowed as he stepped away from me, his glass raised high, and turned toward Renee. Gasps spread like sparks across the room as he extended his hand to her, his words landing sharp as blades. Tonight, I want to share with you all the woman who has shown me what true love means. Renee. Will you? The room fractured into noise. A murmur, then a wave, some guests leaning forward with open mouths, others covering their eyes as though shielding themselves from a sudden glare. Renee, glowing in crimson silk, clasped her hands against her chest, eyes glistening as she rose from her chair. Sophie's note cards fluttered to the floor. Avon turned his face into Nora's shoulder, his small body stiff with confusion. I stood unmoving, my glass poised at my lips, the taste of champagne sharp and bitter. Around us, whispers swirled, names repeated, disbelief growing heavy in the air. And then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The sound of hinges echoed louder than music ever could, and the crowd parted instinctively, heads turning as Charles Hale entered with 2 suited men flanking him. His presence filled the space, his steps measured, his expression cut from stone. Gavin's voice faltered mid-sentence, his hand still extended toward Renee, his smile collapsing in on itself. Father, he managed the word, catching. Charles did not acknowledge him at first. He walked with deliberate calm to the front of the room, the suited men officers, whose badges gleamed faintly in the light remaining just behind him. He stopped, his gaze sweeping across the stunned guests before finally settling on me. For the first time that evening, my hands unclenched. Charles's voice carried easily without need for a microphone. I had not planned to attend tonight, he began, but I thought it wise to witness for myself the truth of what has been whispered to me. His eyes shifted to Gavin, then to Renee, whose triumphant glow had dimmed into unease. And I see I was right. A hush pressed against every wall of the ballroom. I felt Sophie's presence at my side, her small fingers threading through mine, and Evan's uncertain breath close behind me. Charles looked directly at Gavin. You have chosen disgrace over loyalty, cruelty over honor. And in so doing, you have chosen to sever yourself from this family and all it provides. The words landed like a gavel striking wood final and heavy. Gavin's face drained of color, his hand still outstretched to Renee, who now wavered, her smile trembling. The officers shifted forward, their presence undeniable. Gasps echoed, chairs scraped, whispers surged like waves crashing. I remained still, my glass untouched, my gaze steady on the man who had once vowed to protect me. Inside, my heart pounded with the certainty that everything was about to unravel, not for me, but for him. The ballroom's silence cracked as Charles's words settled. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, some covering their mouths, others whispering with wide eyes. Gavin stood frozen, his hand still extended toward Renee, but no one reached for him. His confidence drained away, leaving only the exposed man beneath the performance. Renee tried to bridge the silence with a nervous laugh, her hand fluttering against her gown. "This isn't the time for family disputes," she began, her voice wobbling, but the officers stepped forward. One laid a folder on the table, photographs and documents, spilling out bank transfers, forged invoices, a paper trail of indulgence written in her name. The color drained from Renee's face as whispers surged louder through the crowd. Guests who had toasted her work hours earlier now stared with thinly veiled contempt. She reached for Gavin's arm, desperate for solidarity, but he jerked away, his own panic too sharp to disguise. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. Charles's reply was steady. "Evidence. Fraud committed under the guise of friendship, betrayal carried out in plain sight. And tonight it ends." He motioned to the officers, who stepped closer. Renee stumbled back, her heels scraping across the polished floor, the crimson of her gown now garish under the chandeliers. Gavin's composure shattered. "You can't do this," he hissed, his eyes darting toward me, toward the children, toward anyone who might still defend him. But no one moved. Nora held Sophie and Evan close, shielding them from the spectacle, while I stood steady, the glass still cool in my hand. Renee was led away first, her protest sharp, her voice cracking as the doors closed behind her. The room exhaled a collective sigh tinged with disbelief. Gavin remained standing, his shoulders hunched, his eyes wild as he searched the crowd for sympathy. But faces turned from him, conversations broke into low murmurs, and his once loyal colleagues avoided his gaze. Charles's voice cut through the noise again. "From this moment forward, Gavin Hale is no longer an heir of mine. His actions have cost him the trust of his family, the respect of his peers, and the fortune he once expected. Marin and the children will be secured as they should have been all along." The weight of those words fell harder than any accusation. Gavin's mouth opened, but no sound came. His life unraveled before him, strand by strand, and there was no place left to hide. I felt no triumph in that moment, only the steady release of a burden I had carried too long. Guests began to leave quietly, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Some nodded to me with sympathetic eyes. Others avoided my gaze, eager to slip away from the discomfort of betrayal laid bare. I remained still, watching Gavin as he sank into a chair, his head buried in his hands. Sophie clung to my side, whispering, "Mom, what's happening?" I knelt, smoothing her hair back, meeting her frightened eyes. "The truth came out," I told her softly. "And we're safe now." Evan leaned into me, his small hand gripping mine, his confusion quiet but present. I held them both, drawing strength from their nearness. When the last of the guests had gone, Charles approached. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice low but firm. "It's finished. He will face what he's earned." I nodded, gratitude unspoken, but understood. The officers moved closer to Gavin, guiding him to stand. He resisted at first, his words tumbling in angry bursts, but it was no use. His protests echoed hollowly in the emptying hall, each one swallowed by the silence of those who no longer cared to listen. I watched as he was led away, his suit rumpled, his face pale. the image of the confident man he once projected, now broken beyond repair. For the first time in years, I felt light, as if the walls of deceit had finally crumbled and the air could move freely again. Nora gathered the children, her expression soft but resolute. "Let's go home," she murmured, and I nodded, though I knew nothing would ever be quite the same. As we walked toward the doors, Sophie glanced back, once her brow furrowed, but Evan pulled her hand, urging her forward. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, the stars sharp above the city skyline. I breathed deeply, the weight of the evening lifting with each step. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be ours, free from deceit, free from humiliation, free from the shadow Gavin and Renee had cast. Still, I knew the story was not fully written. There were wounds to mend trust, to rebuild, and children who needed reassurance that the ground beneath them would hold steady again. And as the car door closed behind us, I felt the quiet certainty that the final chapter was still waiting to be told. The days after that night felt quiet in ways I had not known before. The house no longer echoed with tension, no longer carried the weight of secrets pressing against its walls. Sophie and Evan moved through the mornings with an ease I had not seen in months, their laughter at the breakfast table free of the shadows that once lingered behind their smiles. Charles visited often, his presence steady and reassuring. He brought books for Sophie, who was finding new joy in theater rehearsals, and soccer gear for Evan, who seemed lighter with every game he played. Nora stayed close too, reminding me with simple kindness that I was never alone in this. Even Margaret checked in from time to time, her sharp professionalism softened by genuine care for the life I was rebuilding. Gavin's absence grew quieter with each passing week. The children still saw him under the arrangements we agreed upon, but I no longer felt the sting of wondering what might have been. The man who once stood beside me had chosen a different path, and I had chosen to let it go. Renee's name faded into silence, her choices having written their own conclusion. The anger I once carried toward them both no longer defined me. It had burned itself out, leaving space for something sturdier. I began to see life in smaller moments, the sunlight streaming across the kitchen counter. As I brewed my morning coffee, the sound of Sophie practicing her lines, Evan's triumphant grin after scoring a goal. Healing did not come all at once, but it came in these pieces, each one reminding me that dignity is built not in grand gestures, but in choosing each day to keep moving forward. Charles and I spoke one evening as the children played outside. He told me that strength, real strength, was not measured by how fiercely you fight in anger, but by how calmly you protect what matters most. I realized then that I had not only protected my children, I had taught them something about courage and about knowing their worth. Looking back, I see how betrayal tried to define me, but instead, it revealed who I really was. It showed me that I could stand firm even as the world I knew collapsed. It reminded me that silence in the face of cruelty is not kindness, it is surrender. And I will never surrender again. To anyone who has walked a similar path, know this: you are not weak for being hurt, and you are not foolish for having trusted. The weakness belongs to those who betray. The strength belongs to those who survive, rebuild, and keep love alive in their homes. Before we close, I would love to hear from you. Which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.